Good afternoon, hello, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us. Welcome to this Chatham House webinar. My name is Renat Mansour, and I am a research fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, where I also direct the Iraq Initiative. But we are here today gathered to discuss a very important topic today entitled Israel-Palestine, What Next for Palestinians? And we thought about this as the entire world really watches the United Nations struggle to find or to get a ceasefire in Gaza, with the death toll increasing every day to 18,000 killed so far from Israeli strikes, including 8,000 children. But the violence we've seen for the last over a month, starting with the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and the violence since has really shattered a peace, especially a peace perceived by many in the West in particular, but of course many Israelis who believe there was a peace. And the question then has become, what did that peace look like for other people? What did that peace look like for Palestinians? And what does this mean now, the current, this new escalation of violence as part of a longer trajectory of violence that's been part of Israel and Palestine for many, many decades? We thought to bring together experts to discuss some of the key questions looking forward of how to get to peace, but also how to get to a more sustainable peace, a peace that could perhaps be inclusive of all sides, to make sure that it could remain. And to do so, we'd have to interrogate some of the parameters of some of these concepts and terms that we've been discussing in terms of solutions. Many people talk about a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, or maybe a one-state solution. Many people are also looking for who are the Palestinian leaders, and struggle to find them. These people I'm talking about often in the West, but also in these policy debates that we've seen in the US, the UK, Europe, and elsewhere. So we're here today to try and answer some of these questions of whether by default or design, what is sort of the perspective of Palestinians on statehood, on representation, on peace, and what will the implications be at getting something more sustainable that could improve lives and change the trajectory. So very happy to be joined by three really distinguished speakers who have been very vocal and important on the current series of the conflict. Amjad Iraqi is a senior editor at Plus 972 magazine. He's also a policy member of the think tank Ashabaka and was previously an advocacy coordinator at the legal center Abdallah. Dr. Tahani Mustafa is a senior Palestine analyst at International Crisis Group, where she focuses on issues including security and socio-political and legal governance in the West Bank. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Yazid Saigh is a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he leads the program on civil-military relations in Arab states. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for joining this important conversation. I wanted to begin first with Tahani. You've recently published an article where you're trying to look at the day after, what comes next. In particular, what comes next on Palestinian leadership. And we've heard all sorts of different ideas of what that could look like, who could actually govern in places like Gaza. So perhaps maybe first to open with you and some of your thoughts on what in default will happen after a ceasefire.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really good question in terms of who can lead. And I think that has been an issue for Palestinians for the last decade, in the sense that it hasn't been for a lack of initiatives or a lack of processes. It's quite simply been a lack of having adequate leaders that Palestinians can unanimously agree on and recognize as legitimate. So even before the October 7th attack, we saw Palestinians completely disenchanted with their own leadership, which is why we saw so much over the last 2 years, especially with the new right-wing Israeli government that's been pushing Palestinians further into a corner. We've seen these desperate, nihilistic forms of disorganized resistance prop up in the occupied territories. So at the moment, what we're seeing, amongst the international community is now a kind of renewed discourse or discussion around renewing or reviving or revamping a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and then trying to find some kind of legitimate administration, adequate administration for Gaza. And the problem with that is, again, it strips Palestinian leadership of any kind of political substance, and it misses the entire point of why we ended up having October 7th to begin with. And that is unfortunate for the international community to willfully take the wrong lesson from this, which is that Palestinians don't have a recognized unified leadership. They are more divided than they ever have been in history. That division has effectively pushed even a faction like Hamas to a point of desperation, where it wanted to break a stalemate, where it found itself confined in Gaza, administering a strip that for a long time now it has tried to relinquish, but due to the lack of political will from Fatah, which governs the Palestinian Authority, it has not been able to do so through processes of reconciliation. There's been absolutely no political will to try and break out of this current stalemate in the occupied territories. And so today, again, you're having the international community look for an administration that can provide the technocratic levels of governance, like health, education, but misses the entire point of the fact that Palestinians want and need legitimate leaders. They want a leadership that can advocate for them, even if you're talking about on a diplomatic stage here or on a diplomatic level. And that is something that is completely missing in these discussions about the day after, to the point where now you're having proposals of some kind of security administration propping up a potential Palestinian strongman from the security forces to govern Gaza, to keep things quiet, or revamping the PA, again, a PA that can barely contain the non-contiguous patches that it barely controls in the West Bank, where it's not recognized as legitimate. You're having alternative proposals of bringing in a UN mission, which again, any kind of UN mission, which the UN itself has also have been very reluctant to involve itself in because of the lessons it learned in South Lebanon in the 80s, knowing that any kind of administration you now put into Gaza will be considered as a buffer to the occupation, as something abetting Israel's occupation. And the PA has actually been very vocal about that. You know, for Fatah, for an organization or a faction like Fatah, who are bitter rivals of Hamas, to recognize the need for some kind of political process and reconciliation with Hamas at this point, and to recognize that they cannot go in on the backs of Israeli tanks. That really is indicative of the kind of juncture we've hit at this point, even with Israel's military campaign, ongoing military campaign, and statements we're hearing from the Israeli military establishment. So it's still very unclear. Things are very, very unclear at the moment as to who can lead. You know, again, these were discussions that Palestinians were trying to have for the last decade, especially back in 2021. I think that was a real inflection point in the occupied territories, where you had the announcement of elections. And for the first time, you had, you know, cautious optimism, but there was a lot of fervor around that. There was a lot of mobilization around that. And I think a lot of people really missed the point of that. It wasn't about elections per se, but what those elections represented, which was the revitalization of very dormant Palestinian leadership. But unfortunately, that process was not supported by the international community, who are far more concerned about Palestinians electing leaders that Israel and its Western allies would not be able to accept. So there was absolutely no support for that process. And what was made worse was, after Abbas called off those elections, the European Union had him inaugurate the opening of the Elections Commission 6 months later. So again, you know, it really has affected Palestinians' own trust in the international community and in any kind of political process that is being proposed, especially for the day after, which is really just almost a proposal of an Oslo 2.0, which is a denial of Palestinian political rights, denying the fact that they are a people that have legitimate national rights or demands. And it simply is about just installing a kind of subcontractor to the occupation that can maintain quiet.
Thank you. A lot of issues to think about there, Tahani. If I could maybe pose the second question to Yazid. Tahani talked about even this idea of Oslo 2.0, but also I think more generally, a lot of what you're hearing in terms of solutions, whether it's the US or others devising a plan, seem to be taking off from plans and solutions that have been tried and haven't worked over the years, over the decades. Why is there this? Is there a design, is there a logic to this? Why is there this sort of lack of imaginative thinking of what could actually work when it comes to leadership? What is the design and logic to that? And then how can that be overcome looking forward?
That's a pretty challenging question. And I'm going to need to, I guess, subvert sort of the assumptions made here. I mean, one is that, of course, this isn't about imagination, about every possible permutation of what an Israeli-Palestinian peace could look like, from a one state to a binational state to a two-state, three-state, whatever, you name it. And one state, whether it's, one state in which all citizens are equal, or a one state of apartheid in which Israel dominates the entire territory from the river to the sea, which is the reality today. In all these cases, it's not as if we don't know what the building blocks of any of these different kinds of scenarios are. The issue is to look at any of these proposals in their context. What didn't work 20 years ago might work today, or vice versa. But I think more critically, where I want to challenge your question is that there's a lot of talk in Western government circles, media circles, among diplomats, etc. Who could be the next Palestinian leader? Who could take over Gaza? Could it be the Palestinian Authority? Might it be Hamas minus the guns? Could it be Mohammed Dahlan, the former security chief? Arab International Trusteeship? And even for those, in some cases, who call for finally getting the two-state solution back on track, which means specifically establishing a Palestinian state, it tends to be an approach that says, well, let's work out how we can get Palestinian institutions reformed and rehabilitated, how we can find leaders who are accountable and non-corrupt and democratic and so on. And so, in other words, lining up all the ducks in a row first before we finally get to what should have been done 25 or 30 or even 70 years ago, which is to establish a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. So I get suspicious when I hear discussions and proposals start from, let's start on finding the right leaders, starting the right process, managing somehow, providing governance, in the hope that finally that will lead to something we can then turn into a Palestinian state. But this was, after all, what Ariel Sharon, as prime minister in Israel, claimed to seek back around 2005, when he ordered the Israeli pullout of Gaza. And his advisor at the time, I forget his name for the moment, said that basically Sharon's proposal is the Palestinians will get a state when they're, what was it? Something like as Finnish as the Finns in Finland, i.e. in terms of squeaky clean government. And it was, and so we're going back to that sort of nonsense of the Palestinians have to sort of demonstrate their technocratic capability, their ability to construct, non-corrupt institutions, etc., many of which actually existed and functioned at a higher level of integrity and non-corruption and so on in the 1990s than many member states of the United Nations to statehood. So what we have is really, I think, that we're all paying the price for multiple failures on the part of Israel, of course, of the unceasing colonization of the occupied territories prior to the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991, prior to the Oslo Accords, after the Oslo Accords, since 2000, under Labour Party governments, as well as under Likud Party or other far-right coalitions. The Palestinian leadership, which under Arafat failed to mobilize and organize its people in the 1990s, to confront the colonization process without guns in peaceful ways. This is something that was acted, and I think criminally so, and then resorting to guns in 2000 in ways fundamentally misunderstood Israeli politics and the Israeli public and how the dynamic worked, but also approached military means in ways that were fundamentally dysfunctional as well as counterproductive, and ultimately paved the way for Hamas to come in as the more militant, the more radical user of violence with the relaunch of suicide bombings in early 2001. And then we have the Europeans and the American administration. I'll remind you that in 1998 and 1999, just before the so-called final status negotiations were due to start between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the government of Israel, the European Council issued a declaration saying that it endorsed Palestinian statehood unconditionally, that this should, be built on the existing framework for negotiations, but would not be and could not be subject to veto. In other words, the right of Palestinians to national self-determination in the form of a state was not subject to Israeli approval. That was the European position. And the Europeans, moreover, said in the 1999 declaration that the EU would reconsider its position if a state had not emerged within a year of the start of the negotiations. This was, a clarion call, a war cry, saying all of Europe, which at the time still included the United Kingdom, among others, had signed on to helping to bring about a Palestinian state and to push this forward, even if Israel didn't agree. So what we saw after that, of course, was nothing to match that political position, nor even that of President George W. Bush, who was the first American president to take the whole issue to the Security Council and get a resolution in 2002 specifically endorsing Palestinian statehood. None of these key global powers have acted on that ever since. And I'll wrap up by saying that unless there's a radical, bold break with the pattern of the last 25 years on the part of Western powers. And by that, I mean to say something like, we're convening a peace conference in 2024 with the specific and exclusive goal of establishing the Palestinian state with all the diplomatic, juridical, and other implications that has. And therefore that the government of Israel, whoever it is, duly elected, has to deal with that international fact. We need that sort of bold action to break out of the current violence. And otherwise, I feel that if we simply see a continuation of what fundamentally is a sort of waffling abdication covered by rhetoric about, good governance and whatever else, then we'll know that there's no intention, in fact, of changing the trajectory. And we'll hopefully come back to that later on.
Thank you, Yazid. And I definitely want to come back to that, as well as this question of violence on both sides and how, the language of violence and how that works in the conflict today and in the future. I also want to encourage everyone joining online to submit their questions via the Q&A function, and we will be starting to get to those questions. But it'd be great to bring in Amjad on this point. Yazid outlined some of the assumptions held in Western capitals, some of the terms and ways in which they've continued to problematically view Palestinian statehood or its how it could come to fruition. What do Palestinians envision for the future in terms of their statehood? Often something missing in a lot of analysis, but it'd be great to get your sort of analysis on that question. How do Palestinians view or envision their statehood?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Hani and Yazid for these really important inputs. I guess in this question, kind of bridging off from them and adding my own, I would have sort of 3 points I'd want to highlight for the moment. I think as Tahani and Yazid were pointing to, the first thing we have to do is really break out of this strange parameter which still exists in Western policymaking circles and discussions, that the entire paradigm is around one state or two states and so on. The first reason for this is, and I'm going to be a little blunt and I apologize, but a lot of Western policy circles don't really have the credibility to even discuss and contemplate the two-state solution. They have had years and diplomatic power and economic abilities and all these discussions and webinars, et cetera, to be able to engage with this and implement it. And even the fact that the Palestinian Authority, even when it seemed, even sometimes to the discontent of its own people, was actually chasing after recognition of a Palestinian statehood. But in the end, as Yazid and Tani were saying, the reality was that Western policymaking is always going through the lens and the filters of Israeli decision-making. And that in the end, that power asymmetry between what Israel wanted versus what the Palestinians wanted, versus what Palestinians wanted, was always on a massive gap, and that Western policy circles inevitably sided with the Israeli one. And this is why, despite all this space to be able to do so, it has not been implemented. So there's just really no, unless you can really see forces putting that into effect, there's really no space to be able to have to discuss that, just as one element of why it shouldn't be engaged. The second, and this connects a bit more to the question, but the discussions that where a lot of us are observing in Western circles are really so detached from what Palestinians and Israelis on the ground are speaking about. When you go to Israel, when you go to Palestine, and when you're hearing most of the media discourse and the politicians and just the general public, and speaking also on the Israeli side, no one is actually talking about one state or two state. They're accepting a very dominant, not accepting, but they are recognizing a very dominant reality of a single regime that operates between the river and the sea, which is very complex in its design and very varying, but that everyone understands who the master is and who is the overarching state authority. And so when you come to London or Washington or Brussels, etc., and we're hearing Western policymakers speak about this paradigm, no one back home is saying so, neither on the Israeli side nor the Palestinian side. And the basics 101 of policymaking is that it needs to reflect the situation that you're trying to address. And if these are operating on two opposite worlds, regardless of the reasons, then already the premises of this entire discussions need to be thrown out. And this comes again to, like, just on the Palestinian side, for example, most Palestinians, and this has actually been the case for a very long time, where the discourse around statehood is sometimes strategically taken by Palestinians, especially by, for example, the Palestinian Authority, but that is not the paradigm that most Palestinians conceive of their future. When you talk to Palestinians, they're talking about my right to equality, my right of return, my right of liberty, to not have the Israeli military's boots on my neck. These are the kind of ideas that is much more rights-based. It is the Israelis who often can only see this paradigm as statehood, about the Jewish state, about the state maintaining its military dominance. And like I said, even though there is Palestinian acquiescence to this, and that international discourse is primarily thinking about freedom in statehood, that is not how much of the society is perceiving it. And that divergence really needs to be addressed, because in many ways, statehood and the paradigm of statehood is also tyrannical, and has actually been one of the core that even when Palestinians are demanding their own state, how that can still be used against them. And that what much of the Oslo framework, and ever since then, has been offering to Palestinians is not even full statehood, it's a sub-statehood, it's a quasi-statehood, which is always contingent upon Israeli dominance in some form or another, in very explicit and both explicit and implicit ways. And so the real question is not about jumping ahead to solutions, because the space for that has long passed at the moment. We need to rethink. The real fundamental question is about the recalibration of power. The recalibration of power, both in how we're discussing how to advance Palestinian rights, that is not to be filtered through how Israelis think Palestinians should be living and existing, but asking Palestinians genuinely, what do they see as their path to freedom? What do they see as their visioning of self-determination? And there are many, many discussions around this that transcend even the Green Line, which has been erased by the Israelis for a very long time. But trying to understand and conceive how can we rethink political institutions that actually reflect what Palestinians are asking for, providing Palestinian agency from the grassroots to the civil society to the political leadership, as Tahani and Yazid have been discussing, that our own Palestinian political agency needs to be heard as equals to deciding the fate of the conflict, not as subsidiaries or as afterthoughts to it, which is unfortunately how much of Western policy making has been done. So there's a lot to unpack on this, and Palestinian society, as I said, is very diverse in these envisionings, but it has to begin with that recalibration of power to bring down the way that Israel has dominated that policy-making discourse, and elevating Palestinians to be able to reshape how we've been discussing these in these circles.
Yeah, it's a really important note, Amjad, to make, which is, before we talk about policy solutions and get ahead of ourselves in terms of what comes next, what are we actually talking about, and who are we talking about, and what is their perspectives, and looking back and looking at recalibrating, as you say, these structures are important and changing every day as well. And so before we get to the Q&A, Tahani, I had a question that I wanted to ask to you. we're living in this, Palestinians are living in this war in Gaza and other parts. What will the impacts be? What will the impacts of this war be on Palestinian society and their perceptions moving forward as well?
I mean, I think Palestinian society right now is incredibly traumatized. It's completely, unfathomable what has been allowed to unfold in both Gaza and the West Bank now. The West Bank tends to be somewhat of a forgotten element, given all complete disenchantment. Palestinians were desperate before October the 7th. Things were incredibly dire. You had Palestinians going through some of the worst political and economic crises in their respective history, and those trends have only just have simply accelerated. In Gaza, we're seeing a human catastrophe unfold in unimaginable scales, and the same thing almost in the West Bank in terms of the level of violence and desperation. So I think right now Palestinians are not only traumatized, but more importantly have completely lost their faith in the political process, in the international community. And I think Western hypocrisy has probably been more stark this time round than at any point in history. And I think they've also now come to the real cold realization that the recognition of their rights, the recognition of Palestinians as a people with agency is not something that can simply come through conciliatory politics with either Israel or its Western allies. I think, unfortunately, that is the point that Palestinians have been driven to. And again, bringing back, to the point that Amjad raised, Palestinians continue to be considered as a problem to be managed. That is how they are being spoken about today when we talk about day after, when we talk about solutions to the current war that we're seeing unfold. And that has simply, again, increased the loss of faith in the international community and its institutions.
Thank you, Tahani. And Yazid, there's a few questions from the audience looking at the role of, let's say, regional internationals, I think based on some of the comments you gave. Wolfgang Heinrich asks, how likely is it that all the international powers that have determined the trajectory of politics concerning Israel and Palestine will play a similar role this time? Will other regional powers not want to have far more say? And Dina Mufti asks, the American government's lip service is for a two-state solution. However, its actions indicate otherwise, such as vetoing to allow Israel to continue building settlements and vetoing to allow Israel to continue bombing Gaza. What does the American government's actions show us?
Well, fair questions. I'll tackle them in slightly random order. I don't think any regional governments outside maybe of Iran really want to have anything to do with Gaza if they can help it. And of course, here we're talking about a few specific governments, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Emirates, for very different reasons in each case. And probably in the case, say, of the Jordanians and possibly the Egyptians, what they'd rather do is not have to deal with this at all. It's being forced upon them. Maybe the Saudis see an opportunity to move forward on normalization with Israel, precisely if they can, offer themselves as mediators and as part of, say, as guarantors for some kind of Arab or internationally guaranteed outcome in Gaza. I still think the chances of any of that happening are low. Arab governments have other priorities. They've got huge challenges. And when you think of Egypt, which are the most threatened by the kind of talk they hear coming out of Israel, and not just on the far, far right, but from government circles and parliamentary circles in Israel, of transferring, whether voluntarily, supposedly, or not, huge numbers of Palestinians onto their national territory. Clearly, the Egyptians and Jordanians are spooked by this and will want to resist this. But these are very different kind of motivations from the kind that would be needed to proactively push for the kind of outcome which I'm talking about, which is to go forward radically quickly to Palestinian statehood rather than the traditional approach of endlessly putting this off, precisely because we need a break in the current political dynamic. I think one thing about the Oslo Accords which of course produced a lot of disagreement and division among Palestinians, the most important part of the Accords for me was that the act of mutual recognition between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the government of Israel, the creation of a new political opportunity for the national movement of the Palestinians to return inside to its own territory, to be based among its own people, and to engage directly with the Israeli public at all levels. And that was a transformation. It was lost, squandered in various ways by the acts of both sides, I believe, in over the next 6 or 7 years. My point is that right now, unless there's a dramatic political opening that needs this kind of proactive behavior by Arab and Western, as well as Palestinian Israeli parties, then I think we're stuck on a trajectory that's going to become increasingly violent, ugly, miserable for Palestinians, certainly, but ultimately also for the Jewish population of Israel. Because if the far right in Israel has its way, there will come a time, if it's not already there, where Jewish Israelis who dissent become self-hating Jews or traitors and are also subject to violence. This kind of ideology leads to those kinds of outcomes. On the US administration, the question from, I think, Dina, you said, I mean, there's no doubt that for 70 years, if not at least the last 30 since the Oslo Accords, the United States administration has played a pretty negative role on balance. And I'll give you another example that pulls in the Europeans. I don't intend to let them off the hook in any way. And again, this is at a time when the UK was still European in that sense, part of the EU. Back in 2003, after the Israeli army had reoccupied almost the entirety of the West Bank, in response to Palestinian violence, suicide bombing,
I think we've lost Yazid. Not sure if okay, maybe we will. Okay, maybe we can continue and come back to Yazid when he comes back. Amjad, a few questions directed to you based on your interventions that it would be good to get into. Jeff Freund asks, what entity would have the agency to hear what Palestinians want in the way of a reorganization of power? And Salma Musa asks, are there any serious political actors in Israel that try to reimagine Zionism with equal rights for Jews and non-Jews in historic Palestine? Over to you.
I'll answer those in reverse. So the quick answer to the second question is no, there isn't really a force. Zionism is rather historically a diverse ideology in many spectrums, but a lot of those debates are not really happening in the way that certainly Palestinians would want to, and the confrontation of what Zionism has done to Palestinians, even as it is a national movement for for many Jews, not all Jews, but many Jews, but it is a settler colonial project and a set of institutions and ideologies that rules over Palestinians and dispossesses them. There's no real interrogation of this in Israel. And really what's really defining the political and ideological debates inside Israel as we speak is not between sort of like a Zionist left and a Zionist right. It is actually almost entirely within a revisionist Zionist right. That is where your political battles are happening, both in the public and in the political echelons. This is, we've heard many times before about the Israeli right moving more and more towards that right, and it couldn't be more evident than now. And not just in terms of how people support this kind of almost aggressive ideological rightism, but also the indifference with which much of Israeli society has to almost give allow these kind of far right figures to even steer the ship in many respects. And so these are the real kind of battles. I think more of these discussions are happening abroad, especially in the Jewish diaspora, as they're kind of confronting more and more the massive divergences between the values that they hold, especially in the United States, belief in equality and the liberation for all, only to see that Israel, especially, for decades, but even more so in recent years, how much it is really veered against that and is really openly embracing the idea of apartheid in its most blatant forms. But inside Israel itself, that is not really a force to be, it has no political force whatsoever, unfortunately. Regarding the earlier question about the kind of like institutions or agencies that might be able to do this, this is also a major debate. And Tahani was mentioning this, even around the debates around elections for the Palestinian Authority about 2.5 years ago. Most Palestinians don't have illusions about the PA as what they often regard as an authoritarian government, a subcontractor to the Israeli occupation, and its entire security and economic institutions are entirely wrapped up around Oslo, around the Israeli state and the Israeli army. But as Tani was saying, like it wasn't so much what the elections were in practice as what represented for an avenue to be able to express political discontent, to have political debates, and to install some kind of fresh leadership that actually reflects the will of the people in many respects. And there's still a lot of arguments if this is the right way to go. Another dimension of this is the Palestine Liberation Organization, which since the 1990s has really been subsumed by the PA almost deliberately and consciously. But even though the PLO still holds many diplomatic cards and still is officially recognized as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and for a long time, one of the big strategic goals of Hamas was, one of its tactical goals was to actually be included in the PLO, which Fatah has always tried to shut the door on. And so any path forward, if it's not through the PA, then the hope is that even with the discontent against these major political parties like Fatah and Hamas, that the PLO could be in some way revived. How feasible that is a hard question. The PLO itself is not entirely a democratic institution, but it does try to create this sort of diversity among different kind of factions. So at least could this potentially be a stage that does not beholden to the same chokeholds that are placed on the Palestinian Authority. And like Tahani said, this is also reflective that, Palestinians are not looking for another administration. And the PA is, in essence, an administration to try to manage and control the conflict, primarily on behalf of Israelis, and for the international community to say that they've got a hold on the Palestinians. The PLO, for all its flaws and limitations and weaknesses, is still seen by many Palestinians as the engine to try to restore a different kind of leadership, to at least begin the process of a different kind of representation that explores and that includes all major spectrums of Palestinian politics. But as both Tani and Yazid were mentioning, the foot that's been placed on Palestinians about how they can conduct those politics and to just have the space to be able to do so is absolutely vital. And unfortunately, a lot of Western states and policymakers have been very complicit in the Israeli state's, almost natural strategic priority to kill any attempt at Palestinian unity and to undermine it in all sorts of ways. And if international policymakers are serious about allowing Palestinians to have that political agency, they need to take that step back. They need to ensure that the Israeli state does not interfere and obstruct these kind of, and whether it's reconciliation attempts or elections of some kind. I'm not even talking about local elections, outside of the PA, there are all sorts of levels where you have this constant interference. And so that needs to be stepped back and needs to be understood as a space in order to begin to restore that. And through whether it's the PLO or the PA, they can then use these international mechanisms that they have accumulated for years and that Yazid was mentioning in order to begin advancing this in serious ways.
Thanks, Amjad. Yazid, you were cut off, so I wanted to come back to you. Because it's rude that you were cut off, and it's nice to continue to hear what you have to say, but also because off the back of your comments, there have been many other questions related to what you were saying. You were answering Dina's questions, but also Michael Harvey is asking the US and the UK to include the Europeans in this. But if they are supportive of two-state solutions, why have they effectively condoned the building of Zionist settlements in the West Bank by not applying sanctions against Israel? Is this failure to act likely to change in the future? So there are a few questions out to you on what is exactly what you were saying, the position of the US and whether they can, and the European countries, and what that means for any talk of settlement or plans.
Thanks, Renad. No need to apologize. The rudeness came from the Lebanese Electricity Authority, which went for the normal 6 o'clock your time, 4 p.m. cutout. So I don't know, I'm in a friend's house and I don't know what the electricity is coming from now. Luckily I know exactly where I was cut off, and I'll finish off that point just because what I was getting to is that in April 2003, the so-called quartet, composed of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the UN, issued the so-called roadmap to peace. And this was sort of supposedly a response to Palestinian violence, an attempt to get the two-state solution and negotiation back on track. Now, what's really interesting here, and goes to the heart of several of the questions you've had, is that the Palestinians insisted that there be a so-called monitoring mechanism, which would be independent third party and would monitor both Israeli as well as Palestinian performance of agreed benchmarks. The Israelis were adamantly opposed to this. And although the final draft of the plan, the roadmap, contained text on this mechanism, when it was published, miraculously, mysteriously, magically, the monitoring mechanism had disappeared. Now, I was convening an international conference in Cambridge, Cambridge University at the time, and I forget if this was right before the publication of the roadmap or right after, but well, it would have been right before, because we had a significant number of European desk officers, the people specifically in their foreign ministries who dealt with Israel-Palestine and the negotiations. And we had their American counterpart, although he was there in his personal capacity. And it was right there and then in front of me, in my hearing and direct sight, that all these European desk officers discovered from their American counterpart that the roadmap was about to be published, minus the monitoring mechanism. So not only had the Americans gone behind everyone's back and published the draft minus a crucial part of it, but they hadn't even bothered to inform their European counterparts. And from that day on, the Europeans have done nothing but basically roll over, belly up, and left everything to the Americans. Now, that sort of in a way tells us the whole story, because the European Union, for structural reasons, anyone who works on Europe, and of course your Chatham House membership will know this better than most, that when it comes to foreign policy as well as defense policy, the European Union has been almost completely unable to agree on anything but the most obvious issues. I mean, even on Ukraine, there's a very fragile unity there, and certainly no longer on Palestine, and not ever since 2003, if not before. So that's part of the problem here. The structural problem is that the European Union foreign policy making is such that you can't get an effective a collective European role. However, I think that we've also seen instances where individual member states of the European Union can, among the major European powers, there's nothing to prevent a coalition of the willing emerging that says, we're not speaking the name of the European Union, but we, France, or we, Germany, or we, Italy, or whoever, along with hopefully the United Kingdom, will be proactive and take a lead here. So it's not beyond the realm of the impossible. The reason why I think none of this will happen, and this comes to the important question someone put to you about sort of where things go and why, and what happens if all this doesn't come together. We're in a moment in history where for at least the last 2 decades, Western societies have been undergoing increasing social polarization linked to, economic neoliberal economic policies, the concentration of wealth in the top 1% of the population. There is a reason why neo-Nazi parties are re-emerging in Germany, and specifically in East Germany, the people who felt they were left out by unification, and so on and so forth. So Viktor Orban in Hungary and his anti-Semitism, which is somehow okay and acceptable with someone like Bibi Netanyahu, is no longer the outlier. Austria too, maybe next year France as well under Marine Le Pen, and others as well. There's a right-wing trend. We're in a moment of history of deep social, economic, and institutional malaise in the international liberal order and in the liberal politics of Western democracies, including the United States. And we may have Donald Trump back in office next year in the US as well. So who exactly among these potential right-wing governments, do we think is going to suddenly get all serious about Palestinian statehood when it comes to issues of immigration, race relations, and so on in their own countries? They're not willing to confront those frontally. And in this context, it's sad and tragic that the fight against anti-Semitism, which is hugely important and crucial as part of facing both specifically anti-Jewish racism and racism more generally, but this is being paraded in ways in European capitals, in ways that someone like Marine Le Pen suddenly becomes on board, and Giorgina Meloni, whatever her name is, in Italy is on board. These are people who come from the anti-Semitic heritage, and suddenly they're all on board as long as it's okay to be Islamophobic, anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian. And the sort of behavior we see in Germany today, I find astonishing, because it's not what comes from the right wing in Germany. It's what comes from supposedly liberal politicians and cultural institutions that are by the center of the need to uphold its own liberal values and the international liberal system. The kind of position that Keir Starmer has taken in the UK, for instance, on the Gaza conflict, is one where he could barely bring himself to speak about international law for weeks. So when I look forward, this is what I see coming. There is, as I said, the only possible hope is the 1% chance of key governments, the US in particular, the United Kingdom for some of the heft it still carries here and there, and a few leading Europeans to come together and say, we want to put Palestinian statehood on the table before it's really too late. But if they don't do this, then I think what's coming in Israel is something that looks to me like fascism. And what's coming in a large part of Europe and possibly in the United States is what, once upon a time was called fascism. It could be, it'll be more moderate here, be parliamentary and electoral based there. It might not be, physical in the absolute sense, although the obsession with crucifixes and guns among the neo-Nazis in Germany, or among Norwegian far-right people, the kind who slaughtered 85 young Socialist Party members 10 or 11, 12 years ago. This is part of where we're going if bold action isn't taken by our politicians. And I frankly don't think that's coming.
Thank you, Yazid, especially for situating and contextualizing what's happening in Palestine and Israel today within the bigger sort of international system, and sort of transformations in the international system as being explicitly linked to the conflict, and any discussions of what could come next in terms of sustainable solutions is really important to use as a contextual tool. Tahani, to go back to the questions, there's been several questions on leadership. People are still wondering what comes next. There are a few questions around Hamas. Ghada Musa, for example, asks, do you think it is possible in the future to neglect Hamas in any negotiations, either concerning the reformation of the Palestinian Authority or from negotiations over the Palestinian state? And then there's also a question from looking at the kind of internal Palestinian leadership debates and contestations. Arusa Fatima asks, to what extent and how have rivalries between Fatah and Hamas is affecting the cause? So I'll leave those two questions to you.
Thank you. So to start with the first one, is it possible to neglect Hamas? I mean, I think, as I said previously, we're at a juncture now where it's pretty indicative that it is not going to be possible to ignore Hamas. Hamas isn't going anywhere. Hamas isn't an armed wing. It's a political movement. It has its, bases also in the West Bank. It's got its external leadership. So, and again, if Fatah is able to come to that conclusion that any thinking in the day after has to involve some kind of process that includes Hamas, then again, that's indicative. Hamas isn't going anywhere. So yes, I mean, whether the international community likes it or not, I mean, this is they have openly proclaimed that engaging with Hamas is a non-starter in terms of any kind of political process moving forward, which is fantasy. It's complete fantasy. And Hamas can either be facilitators or spoilers to any process that comes after this. And whether they like it or not, they're going to come to the realization that they're going to have to deal with Hamas in one way or another. And we're starting to sort of see the signs of that now. Just recently we had the Doha Forum. We had, members of Hamas's external leadership and members of Fatah, like Dahlan, Nasser al-Qudwa. You had some of the Qataris, for instance, meeting with these officials, trying to figure out some kind of post-war arrangement. So it's still unclear how those alliances are forming. They're still, in the process of formation. Alliances are still shifting, but that is all very indicative that Hamas is an actor that cannot be ignored, even if we're thinking day after. And again, as long as we continue to have the context that breeds an organization like Hamas, you will need to engage with these radical elements. And unfortunately, that seems to be where Palestinians are being almost forced into. We're seeing younger generations who've become so disillusioned and desperate by the current context. They don't see conciliatory politics as offering a way forward. They've seen that. They've seen that what conciliation can offer them for the last 3.5 decades. And in that time, if anything, they've lost more land and more rights. So it is very, again, it is very indicative in terms of Israel and its Western allies having to really try and get to grips with the reality that is being created on the ground. And these radical elements are not going anywhere. Even if you don't have Hamas, you will still have some kind of vestige of Hamas. And like I said, they can either be facilitators or spoilers to any process. And that is something that they're going to have to get to grips with. With regards to the second question, regarding Hamas and Fatah rivalries, of course, yes, it's been a detriment to Palestinian democracy. It's been a detriment to the national movement and to Palestinian national leadership. But this goes well beyond just Hamas and Fatah. It kind of misses the point as to what has happened or what Palestinian institutions post-Oslo were intended towards, right? So the assumption with Oslo is that it was some sort of peace process. It was not a peace process. In retrospect, it was actually a process of capitulation. And what it ended up doing, I think that was really the start of where we saw these divisions start to sort of sow themselves within the Palestinian leadership. It started to offer them spoils to fight over. And in the process, you saw Palestinian leaders become far more conciliatory and far more willing to cede over a lot of Palestinian rights and national demands. We don't have a leadership at the moment that thinks in nationalistic terms. We have a very self-interested leadership that thinks in very individualistic terms. And that has been very incredibly detrimental to Palestinian national institutions, including the PLO, whereby you now have Fatah that is absolutely unwilling to relinquish its hegemony over that one institution that it retains any kind of control over, having lost the PLC or the Palestinian Legislative Council or the PA institutional body to Hamas in 2006. But yes, absolutely, those rivalries have really done nothing to help consolidate or to help ease Palestinian divisions. If anything, you now have a self-interested leadership in Fatah that, again, is willing to cede over pretty much any kind of national demand in order to maintain their hegemony and their spoils in the West Bank. And then equally, those accusations were thrown at Hamas prior to the October the 7th, where for many Palestinians, again, never mind Hamas's abysmal governing record, but the fact that, Hamas wasn't, very conducive to allowing, just as Fatah wasn't in the West Bank, to any kind of Palestinian pluralism within Gaza. So they really have, driven us to this current juncture that we're at now.
Thank you. Thanks to Hani. Amjad, there's a question again. There are a few questions, but I'll ask the one from Roger Bowden, who put simply asks, why not focus on the one-state reality and try to influence what that looks like? And maybe in a few minutes, there seems to be this very difficult clash between a state that could be a state under the rule of law, with citizens all being equal and accountability and these types of mechanisms, but also this sort of ethno-nationalism and the identity politics that does govern a state like Israel. So if we discuss something like one state, or what would that even look like? What could potentially help people think through some of these big challenges?
I mean, this connects a little bit to some of the things I was saying earlier, is that the massive distance between how people on the ground understand the reality and how oftentimes it feels like we're being gaslit by people abroad about what is actually operating on the ground is quite wild. Like, I mean, I myself have been in many, and my colleagues, I'm sure, have been in many sort of, in capitals and government offices and other think tanks, etc., where they're insisting to us that there is no one state reality and that what we're saying is nonsensical or ideological or even racist by even saying it. But I mean, just speaking on the personal level, I'm a Palestinian citizen of Israel with a blue ID card and the yellow license plate. And all I've ever known is one state. That up until the blockade of Gaza, I'm to this day, I'm still able to go into the West Bank anytime. An Israeli citizen, Jewish Israeli, can easily live in settlements. If you're in Jerusalem, you would never know that you were crossing the green line to casually go to your home or for shopping or etc. And a lot of diplomats on the ground often know this, but for some reason it's just never translating because there's this inbuilt denialism when it comes to how centers of power are trying to discuss this, which is very infuriating. And so even when Palestinians do try to emphasize that, and even try to make people realize how much it's that even the concept of a one state or apartheid or whatever you want to call it is not something that's happening on the horizon. It has been a reality, and not just of the past few years. The one state reality occurred the moment Israeli soldiers set foot on the Jordan Valley and on the Gaza coast in June 1967. And ever since then, there's been a consolidation and had ebbs and flows and recalibrations in the way that Tani was describing what Oslo did. And the Palestinian leadership may have seen Oslo potentially as a strategic move, but it ended up being very clearly a strategic miscalculation of epic proportions, to which Palestinians to this day are unfortunately suffering. And so in terms of how to kind of grapple with that, I mean, I think Palestinians on the ground are certainly trying to do so. Like I said, there's actually a whole almost shared political identity and social reality and economic relations that exist beyond the Green Line, with Gaza being in severe blockade. But even Gaza, and the past 2 months has been so emblematic of this, that despite attempts to kind of separate it from this one state reality, Gaza is actually the epitome of where that one state reality can be heading. And that the idea of forced expulsion, or what Palestinians describe as a Nakba, is not far off. This is what the one-state reality is currently offering us because of that massive power asymmetry. And so this is really the conversation that has to be had. It's that it's not the threat of one state. If we recognize that it is, and Western policymakers and policy circles really need to catch up to this very basic understanding, which even Jewish Israelis know, that partition is very real and violent in many ways. Partition of the land has been real and violent in many ways, but it's also a lie. And if that's the lie, then what we're really entrenching is that power asymmetry, that Jewish Israelis have power first and Palestinians get what's left over. And if that's where, the outside world has kind of pitted its, that we prefer that kind of status quo, then that's a fundamental problem. What Palestinians are demanding is that you change that, you enable our power, you open up the space for us to recognize our rights, and you understand that the Israeli state is not interested in a two-state solution. I mean, it's telling, even, for example, the way that, as Tahani was saying, like, the way that Hamas, that because of the violence of October 7th, which should be investigated, held to account as a matter of international law, but somehow Hamas is now beyond the realm of acceptable politics in Israel-Palestine. Yet a party like the Likud, which has, for the past century has been almost single-handedly been pushing Israeli politics to the right, entrenching Greater Israel, really usurping the land in material and ideological realities in very profound ways, that is somehow not outside the realm of politics. I'm not saying this as a question of whataboutism, but it's, again, where are these fundamental blind spots of what is acceptable in this one-state reality, that certain kinds of Jewish Israeli political parties, as long as they're not maybe Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but that other mainstream ones who are entrenching that one-state reality are acceptable. Yet a group like Hamas, which officially in its own revised charter talked about the 1967 borders as for Palestinian statehood, and as I think was being mentioned before, like, that it's problematic that all attempts to either participate in elections or engage in reconciliation or bring about a change in public discourse, that all these avenues, even something as boycott, divestment, and sanctions, that all these avenues are closed off, forcing Palestinian groups like Hamas or other militias to think that the only way to get the world's attention and for the world to take it seriously is violence. And this is not about justification, but it is about what are the strategic conditions that have been created to make this happen. And this is outrageous, that because Palestinians aren't interested in a forever conflict, they're interested in achieving their rights in a way that does not harm their societies and harm their communities. But if they are now feeling such existential dread, it won't just be Hamas. This is something shared across Palestinian society, that our cause and our people are under an existential threat because of indifference, because of complicity, and because of a acceptance that Palestinians can be constant collateral damage as long as Israel and Israelis feel safe. And that needs to be completely switched over, including in the current reality that we have now.
Mhm. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I feel like we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on some of these big questions. But it's been really great. Thank you so much to the speakers, Amjad, Tahani, and Yazid, for giving us the context, for giving us the analysis, and really forcing us to think through in different and more important ways some of these big questions that are being asked. Thank you to the audience. Apologies that we couldn't get through all the questions. This is one of the biggest sort of events we've had as a webinar, which I think speaks to how important this is as a topic, and certainly a conversation that we will continue with the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program as part of our Israel and Palestine series. Thank you to everyone for joining. And once again, thanks to Yazid, Amjad, and Tahani for your brilliant insights. Take care.
Thank you for having us.